Hi there. Today we are speaking about Sagittarius ascendants. Now keep in mind, we are using Vedic astronomical measurements. And this means that most people who are used to looking at their charts in tropical will have their signs move back by one. And this means that if someone is using a tropical chart calculator and they see that they're a Sagittarius ascendant, most likely they'll actually end up being a Scorpio ascendant. And if someone is a Capricorn ascendant in the tropical system, they're most likely going to be a Sagittarius ascendant in Vedic. Keep in mind also that there is about 6-degree overlap period where if someone is at the very late degrees of a placement in tropical, it can end up being the same thing in Vedic, just different by degree. So make sure that you're using a Vedic chart calculator when you are getting your chart information so that you are sure that you have the correct astronomical measurements for your placements. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into a Sagittarius ascendants. So a good title to call Sagittarius ascendants could be something like the adventurers. Now these people, they are lovers of life, positive, bubbly often, people that look for that silver lining, that focus on the positive and really thrive in that. And Sagittarius is ruled by Guru, Jupiter, as they call it in the tropical system. And, this means that higher wisdom, philosophy, the meaning of life is deeply interwoven with their journey and path towards self-knowledge. It really nourishes and contributes to their identity, the path of learning who they are. It's going to be deeply interwoven with their meaning of life, their philosophy, and with the experiences that they have in their journeys and in their pilgrimages and their adventures, which they so love to do. So these are the types of people that really don't like to focus on the negative. They're not ones to easily be kept down. They're not ones to easily be contained or restrained. They want to expand, and through this expansion, they grow and they come to know themselves. For them, life is their greatest teacher. Direct experience is their greatest teacher. And so, although, you might think of Guru as something that's very studious and knowledge-oriented, which it is, they're not usually the ones you'd find just buried in books all the time, or just like in the library, or in a kind of, modern school system, kind of focusing on learning in that way. No, they're going to want to put themselves into situations in life, to go out into the world, to experience directly, and they're going to learn that way. They're going to learn through experience. So instead of just reading books about people who are expressing philosophies and knowledge, they're going to want to go learn from those people directly. And they're going to want to kind of, be traveling and be on an adventure, and then meet them in some synchronistic happenstance, and, just be talking and having a good time. And then, boom, the wisdom comes in. And then they're just like, wow. And so through this movement, through this expansion, through this direct experience, they're going to be learning more about who they are. They're going to be growing their philosophy, and they're going to be shining brighter and brighter as they grow. So, how is it that they come to be this way? Well, it's very interesting, actually, when you look at the second house of a Sagittarius ascendant, because there we have Capricorn. And Capricorn is, in many ways, a type of opposite to Sagittarius. And so when it comes to their childhood experiences, the families that they're born into, they can find themselves born into rather strict, kind of restrictive, a bit cold perhaps environments. They might be born into like a military family, or to business people, or to people who are just very kind of materially focused, career kind of focused individuals. And then they're like the hippie of the family, whereas everyone else is kind of trying to walk these proven paths, these kind of like what many people in society are doing, the kind of certain thing like go to school and do this and get a job and have a career and, no, do all these things on time. And they're going to be the ones that are dreamy. They want to go out and explore. They want to find natural ways of living. And so they can kind of feel a bit like the oddballs of the family when it comes to that. And yet it's interesting that this environment that they're brought up into can very much help to cultivate their desire to explore. The contrast of that can kind of push them to do something different, to go on a journey to find the knowledge that may or may not have always been present in their childhood experiences. It's kind of like, with that Capricornian environment, this contrast, cultivating this perspective and this desire of like, there must be something more to life. Let me go out there and find what that is through direct experience. And also the very structured environments and family situation that they're brought up in does create a sort of, knowledge which is saturated inside of them of what it looks like to be responsible, to be structured, to be disciplined, to have the sort of material world in order, so to speak. And so, there can be a latent knowledge in them of how to save money and manage assets. Now, it's interesting because a lot of Sagittarius ascendants may not actually focus on that, especially not in the earlier parts of life, until they've, before they've had their adventures and after they've had their adventures and kind of come to that self-knowledge. It can be very different chapters, especially when you look at their Navamsa charts. But there is definitely that education of what that looks like, which is there. And so when it does come time to manage their assets, to save, to build up their wealth and things like that, they can actually have a maturity and a structuredness and just the knowledge of how to do that. It's there, right? But because Guru, who rules Sagittarius, and Shani, Saturn, who rules Capricorn, can be very opposite, expansion and contraction, and, just kind of like the clash that can be there, it may not feel good for them to actually focus on that. They might feel a bit sometimes detached from the assets and the wealth when it comes to kind of just like buckling down and maybe not going on an adventure versus focusing on doing, or not going on an adventure and then doing that instead. So they'll often choose the adventure. They'll choose the experience. They're going to want to do those things before they focus on those kind of material things a lot of times. And so their third house is ruled by Aquarius, which is also ruled by Shani. And so another interesting thing about this is how their skill set that they develop in life is often deeply woven with communities. And so Sagittarius ascendants can really kind of seek out communities in a lot of ways in order to find friends, in order to, feel like they can communicate with people freely, in order to develop their skill set and their willpower and their drive and their courage in life. It'll often be very, very deeply tied with their network circles. And so although Sagittarius ascendants, they have this kind of spiritual, almost monk-like, desire of travel and alternative ways of living and stuff like that, they still generally won't want to do that completely alone by themselves. there'll be a deep need to connect with people, to be able to communicate with people who are of a similar mind. The people they want to hang out with and uh, just talk with and communicate and have fun with, they're going to be people who they feel have some type of humanitarian view and purpose about things. So, they could be hanging out with activists or, people that take care of animals or people that want to form alternative communities. And they'll really find a lot of joy and fun in spending time with these individuals. And, when it comes to their younger siblings, they can have younger siblings that are a bit more kind of coldly logical, likely well connected. They can have a lot of kind of like traditionally successful family members, people who have money, people who have careers, people who are well networked and favored by society. And so they can find that kind of a contrast there. And then they're still going to look to connect with people, look to be well connected themselves, but oftentimes with kind of alternative people looking for that wisdom, looking for that spiritual purpose behind what they're doing. So as a result of this contrast between Guru and Shani, they can find themselves feeling rather misunderstood in their family environment, with their younger siblings, with the kind of family group that they were raised with. And so when it comes to their Pisces in the 4th house, they're going to actually feel very at home in foreign lands. So, they can find more of that comfort and peace when they move abroad, when they move overseas. And when it comes to their home environment, they're going to want something that is Zen-like and spiritual and just really peaceful and joyous on the subconscious psychic wavelength of things. It's going to be a place where they don't have to think so much. They don't have to feel so structured and disciplined and, rigid. It's going to feel like they can breathe and feel. And so, because Guru rules both Sagittarius and Pisces, you're noticing a link here between their 1st and 4th house. So while they're actually going out into the world on these grand adventures to faraway lands, they're in many ways still looking for a home, looking for a safe place, looking for a place where they can feel completely and authentically themselves without having to put on any type of show, any type of, structured societal form in order to feel accepted, in order to feel welcome. And their home is really going to be a place where they don't like to have a lot of conflict, where they don't want to feel strife and rigidity. They're not going to really like there to be conflict or arguments and things like that. They're going to want a place that feels spiritually enlightening, a place where they can connect to the spirit world, a place where they can dream freely, where they can focus on art and beauty and really, feeling life as it is. So their home space is a place where they can feel the beingness of life rather than the doingness. And their 5th house is ruled by Aries. And so here, when it comes to their creativity, their artistic expression, they're going to be very passionate about these things. They can be very passionate and driven about their art, about their creativity, about fun. They'll feel motivated and self-initiated when it comes to having a good time, to creating something that feels authentic to them. It's really, really powerful senses of self-expression. And, 5th house ruled by Leo, or 5th house ruled by, Leo and the sun. and the sun being exalted in Aries, which is ruled by Mars. So you have that synastry, that beautiful resonance here of a kind of exalted creative space. And so, you can find someone, because Aries also has this energy of maybe being a bit impulsive. It's a little bit less practical, but it's so driven and so focused and, so action oriented, to where they could be like the people who are like, I'm going to be an artist, I'm going to just make this and it's going to be great. And then, their family members might be like, how are you going to make money off of that? How are you going to make a career off of that? How are you going to, and they're like, it'll happen, it'll be in alignment. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. And in that doing it, again, because Aries also relates to the first house and self-development, they can find so much self-knowledge in their creative expression. And fifth house also has to do with children. And so, they can be very passionate about their children. They excited and wanting to do so many things. So, they can go hiking with their kids, and, they're going on adventures with them, and there's like all these activities and drive and inspiration and fun and things like that with the children that will be present. And they can also be mama bears kind of with their children, when it comes to having to defend them. They can fight for their kids so powerfully, just being such a strong advocate. And that's when that kind of aggression, protective warrior energy can come out, is when their children are in a situation. It's just like, boom, all of a sudden, they're ready to throw hands. It's just like, if it means protecting the kids. And so they can be very, very driven and determined in these areas. And, their children also, they'll tend to have children that are, maybe a bit wild and crazy sometimes, but also driven, also focused, very active children. So just kind of running around, doing things, climbing trees, running through the woods, like these kinds of things they'll actually really love to see in their kids. They wouldn't want their kid to just be kind of like holed up and just being like, and not doing anything. They're going to want to go out and do things. And so, anyone who's kind of marrying a Sagittarius ascendant, know that the children will likely be very passionate, very intense, perhaps a bit impulsive. And they'll kind of support this energy in the children because of their growing up with their Capricorn in the second house and knowing what it's like, if the kid's like, and running around, being noisy and being passionate. In a Capricorn-like environment, they're like, no, you got to sit down and, stand in line and don't scream so loud, and, kind of almost treating the child like a mature adult way before they reach that level, kind of like not letting them be a kid. And so the Sagittarius ascendant will almost do the opposite and really appreciate and support the children's nature of being a child, of going out and doing things and having fun and being a bit wild and loud and driven and running around and things like that. And so that could be a really beautiful thing. And also, fifth house has to do with dating. And so, when it comes to who they're drawn towards in a romantic sense, especially in the dating phase, they'll be drawn to people that are kind of go-getters, who are, young at heart, who are passionate and who are driven and kind of act first and think later. And so they can very, very quickly get into relationships very fast. They can meet somebody and then know them for a few days, a few weeks, a few months, and then just boom, date them. You know what I mean? Like, and there's not often like a whole lot of thought that can go into that because the moment is so important to them. The feeling state is so important to them. So the beginning of a relationship with a Sagittarius ascendant is often so full of passion, so full of, fun and drive and all these things. And the challenge comes in is when it's time to sustain that, when it's time to really actually, be more in the committed, stable, steady energy of a relationship and things like that. that's where they can kind of experience more of a challenge. But the beginning is almost always going to be just amazing and fun. And so they can see that kind of with their kids as well, you know, where while they're valuing this beingness, this drive, all these things, when it comes to trying to discipline the kids, when it comes to trying to make sure that they have a more well-rounded, stable development, that part can be challenging for them to actually do. So it's very important to keep that in mind. And of course, other placements in the chart, you know, can see where all these things are more enhanced or maybe a bit contrasted by certain placements and things like that. But these are all very important elements to them. And so then we get to Taurus in the 6th house. And this is an intriguing one because Taurus, you know, represents such a stable, nourishing, wealthy, pleasurable, thriving energy for a person. And here we have it in the 6th house of challenges and karma and illnesses and litigations and enemies and battles in a way, you know, and all these things, and also self-improvement and perfecting things and solving problems. And so, you know, the kind of like hippie adventurous lifestyle, the freedom that they're drawn towards can make it challenging for them to kind of maintain that wealth, to maintain that stability, to maintain that growth. And so that can end up being a difficult point for them. You know, if you kind of think of the sort of hippie alternative lifestyle, you know, you have so many people that are prioritizing freedom, prioritizing higher knowledge, prioritizing adventure, and then they may not have as much money. They may not have as much just material abundance. And so it's not to say that they can't get those things, but it can be a point of challenge. It can be a bit of like an insecure point in their vibratory frequency. And so, you know, when it comes to like their enemies, for example, you can find their enemies may very well try to target their abundance, you know, their wealth, to try to kind of, you know, when there are problems in their life, it can kind of pertain to that. Like they might be in a relationship where they're having a great time and they're going on adventures, they're doing these fun things, but how are they going to make the money? And those are the things that their Capricorn upbringing wanted them to prioritize. And so here you kind of get this sort of yin and yang push and pull between Shani and Guru, you know, Saturn and Jupiter, and where they have to kind of contemplate, how do I integrate this beautiful, free, fun-loving, expansive life and beingness that I want with actually having to have some type of material foundation. And that journey, you know, you can really look at where Venus is, which rules Taurus, and where Shani, their placement planet, is, you know, where their Guru placement is, to kind of see a little bit like how that's going to play out for them, like what type of conclusions they'll draw. You know, some people might swing to one side of that pendulum or the other. But that is sort of like a philosophical and material challenge that they face, is how do they get both, right? And so in the 7th house, they have Gemini. And so, you know, when it comes to their relationships, whether it be romantic committed relationships, whether it be their one-on-one friendships, even their business partnerships, you know, you can find them being drawn towards kind of carefree, non-serious sort of people. You know, people that are spontaneous, intelligent, fun-loving, you know, witty, things like that. Makes them feel good, helps to sustain the Sagittarius ascendant's positivity. Because Gemini and Sagittarius, they love fun. They love being positive. They love kind of being not negative. And Capricorn will just be like, bear that negativity and bear the bad feelings, tough it up, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you know, kind of vibe in order to get the material result and the result in society that it's looking for. And so, here we can kind of get that type of relationship dynamic where they are able to have so much fun with these people. But kind of when it comes to anything serious, that's where it'll struggle. So when it comes to like having a committed like marriage, Sagittarius ascendants can actually have quite a bit of difficulty if what they want is a committed marriage. Not all of them want that. I've met a lot of polyamorous people that are Sagittarius or Gemini ascendants or have prominent placements in those signs. So, for someone who wants polyamory, this is one of the absolute placements to demonstrate that is a thing for them. But for a Sagittarius ascendant that maybe has some other placements that leans them towards monogamy and commitment and marriage, that can be a tricky thing because, their partners are people that really like the spontaneity, that like the novelty, that like the multiplicity of things like polyamory, of just sudden changes and kind of a fickleness that comes with that. And, Gemini being ruled by Mercury and Guru ruling Sagittarius has an interesting kind of dynamic and interplay as well, because they're both in a way intellectual. They're both in a way teachers. And they both like to communicate, to learn new things. And so they can find a really great resonance with that in common. So like when they, the Gemini partner, might always keep them laughing, and helping them be positive and helping them to constantly consider new ideas. And they really love that. They love the kind of expansiveness that comes with always kind of throwing these new thoughts and these novel ideas and keeping them stimulated and making their adventures even more fun. But also, Guru has to do with wisdom. And Mercury is a bit more of a kind of intellectual, thought-based intelligence. And so when it does come to the spiritual aspects of themselves and who they are, when it comes to their meaning of life, like why they're on the journey, why they are on the adventure and doing these things, their mercurial partners may not comprehend or value that why as much. They love the ride, but maybe might not resonate as much with the reason for it. And so, again, we kind of get this dynamic where although they're having a lot more fun now, it's almost like a pendulum swing in the other direction from their Capricornian upbringing, where they wanted to have so much freedom and kind of not be tied down in a way, to not be so rigid. Then they get the opposite, where it's not rigid and it's very spontaneous and very free, in the sense of freedom being a kind of ability to decide new things in the moment without being tied down and restricted by something. Now they're kind of, again, faced with this contrast of, oh, here's the other side of that pendulum, right? And so finding a way to bridge that can be important, the Sagittarius ascendant and the Gemini person, they might really communicate well in a lot of ways. They might have so much, almost endless things to talk about. But the Sagittarius ascendant person is also going to be able to feel the beingness and the wisdom and the reason behind the thing. And so there's a lot of things that with a Sagittarius ascendant that may not need to be said, may not need to be explained, because they just get it. And they'll find themselves a little bit confused perhaps sometimes when their mercurial partner doesn't just get it, doesn't just immediately have that beingness and feeling state to know the reason behind the thing. And so they'll kind of have to sit down and explain that and then try to get it. And the mercurial person is just like kind of over intellectualizing the feeling states. And they're like, how do you, bridge that? And so that can be kind of the challenge there with that placement. But it is very fun, and it is very spontaneous and novel and new, and those things that the Sagittarius ascendant will enjoy very much. And so all this ties in interestingly with their Cancer in the 8th house. And the eighth house has to do with something that is hidden, secretive. It's something deep, deep, deep within a person, something that is profoundly needed, but can be challenging to express, can be challenging to kind of get openly. It's something intimate. And so, this deep fundamental need that they find themselves having has a lot to do with this feeling of home, this feeling of connection and being loved and being chosen, like the sentimentality of it, the safety of a home. And so there can be traumas in this area for a Sagittarius ascendant that most people may not know about because they're so positive and they're so life-giving and light-giving to those around them that it might be hard for those people who are friends with them to really see what it is that they're struggling with beneath the surface. And when it comes to connecting intimately with someone, like in their relationship, like what that Gemini partner would kind of need to do to nourish that seventh house, it's going to be being very deeply sentimental with them, feeling like they're choosing the Sagittarius ascendant because of who they are. They treasure them, they hold them deeply in their heart. And depending on, because eighth house has to do with traumas as well, the Sagittarius ascendant may have a difficult time discerning that feeling from the Capricorn feeling, because marriage can feel a bit constricting when somebody's looking at it from a kind of Saturnian point of view. Saturn Shani is exalted in the seventh house in Libra, and so a lot of times their relationship struggles it's very internal for the Sagittarius ascendant, but they may not realize it because they want to be chosen. They want to have the consistency deep beneath the surface, but they're also scared of what the kind of surface or appearance of that could be. They want the connection, but they're afraid of the restriction that can come with it. And so when it comes to dating a Sagittarius ascendant, it can kind of be like this thing where there's this deep emotional connection and a bit of detachment, kind of like someone telling them, I love you and I choose you and, you're amazing and I have this special place in my heart for you, but you can go if you want, and that kind of interesting dynamic can actually help them to open up. Because if somebody kind of approaches a Sagittarius ascendant and is like, wow, I love you, you're so special to me, and I want to marry you, and then you can't see other people, and we're going to do this and be super, kind of constrained by this contract and stuff like that, it can kind of scare them and bring up those early childhood wounds and fears and things like that, dislikes that they experience. And so for a Sagittarius ascendant to really kind of contemplate and be able to feel the distinction between Cancer and Capricorn can bloom a lot of wisdom and help them to overcome a lot of challenges that might otherwise be in their life. Because sometimes for a Sagittarius ascendant, they can almost feel like the same thing. And it's interesting because things that are opposite each other in astrology, whether it's Sagittarius and Gemini, how they're on an axis, and Cancer and Capricorn are on an axis, etc. They're things that are in some ways opposites, in some ways can seem almost like contradictory to each other, and at the same time they like need each other and they complement each other. And so if one only sees the ways in which they're different and kind of is scared of that or doesn't learn how to bridge that, and they can end up feeling a lack somewhere in their life where they're like, wow, they're scared of this or that thing, but then they end up lacking the gift that is in that. And so that's really key is, how do you have freedom and deep, intimate, emotional, sentimental, family-like connection and emotional sentimentality while at the same time having like material abundance and having the consistency of like a marriage where someone is there for you in a consistent way. Like even if the relationship gets a bit challenging, or if the situation's a bit challenging, they're not just going to leave you and go on to a new thing. And so they have to find this balance and find a way to bridge these seemingly contradictory concepts so they can end up with what they really want is kind of like to have it all. You know, as Jupiter gurus is such this expansive energy, it's like it wants all the blessings, you know. And so getting there and really seeing that is key. And also for a Sagittarius ascendant, kind of like there can be deep spiritual and kind of karmic elements with their mother and with their matriarchal lineage. So the fourth house, there being Pisces, shows this deep spiritual psychic kind of connection that can be with the mother. You know, there can be favor there. There can be a lot of good feelings there. And at the same time, kind of a trauma because of the eighth house Cancer. And so, you know, healing their relationship with their mother, even if, you know, because, you know, if they have some really intense placements and with Moon or with fourth house or with Cancer, then they might not be able to do that very easily, like actually in person with their mother or, you know, what have you. But doing it on an emotional level, just for themselves, you know, like doing it on a spiritual level can actually help them to kind of open up and find that intimate connection more and to get to the deeper elements of relationship instead of it just being about like this kind of surface level fun thing. And connecting with their own feminine energy and their own vulnerability, which can be challenging. And so doing that can actually help to attract more intimate and vulnerable, safe, vulnerable connections and situations that will allow them to have more of what they want. And so their ninth house is Leo. And so very, very powerful alignment when it comes to having Sagittarius there in the first house and another fire sign in the ninth house, which is ruled by Guru. And so, you know, they can shine and just be so powerful when it comes to their philosophy. Like when people often think of spirituality and they know Sagittarius ascendants, that Sagittarius ascendant can kind of pop into their mind as something of an ideal, as something of someone who exemplifies that. They can really feel like so much authenticity and self-empowerment and pride with their spirituality. Those two things are very deeply linked. And so the wiser they become, the more self-knowledge and life experience and things that they accumulate, the more that they'll feel confident within themselves. The more they'll be able to feel happy with who they are. And so again, with Sagittarius being in their first house and Leo being in their ninth house, who they are authentically and their meaning of life and their spiritual wisdom are inextricably linked for a Sagittarius ascendant. And, you know, when it comes to being like in spiritual circles and, you know, that sort of thing, they can really be like the star of the show. They can really come through and be almost like a spiritual celebrity. And that's a really beautiful and powerful thing. And I think, you know, when you think of Leo in its higher aspects and its higher octaves, they can serve as such a beautiful and powerful role model, an inspiring figure for what spirituality is, what it looks like to embody it. And their light of who they are can change people's lives just by people seeing them, by getting to know them. They become a living example of higher frequency states of being. And ninth house also has to do with like our early spiritual teachers, like our early spiritual lessons. And so, you know, one of the core principles of why they go on adventures, why they pursue spirituality, it's truly to know themselves. You know, the Oracle of Delphi says, know thyself and thou shalt know the universe and God. And this is such a powerful powerful alignment and knowledge and wisdom for a Sagittarius ascendant. You know, regardless of kind of like what a lot of the spiritual teachings they receive as a child is on the surface, a lot of the lesson they're going to get from that is the beauty, importance, and power of being 100% authentic. And for them, the meaning of life is often deeply tied with that. How can I be 100% authentic? And so, you know, that as powerful as that is, that's also why some of these other challenges come into play, is because, you know, say marriage, for example, you know, a lot of times if you're looking at like traditional marriages, you know, 1950s kind of stuff, which isn't really traditional, but it's what people kind of say when they say that. But, you know, you find people that will sometimes, like the fear, it's like being in a commitment, being in this situation at some point, like whether they like it or not. And it can get so focused on the duty of it, like, oh, you know, the contract says that these people can't get a divorce. And so even if they're miserable, they won't do it. Right? And that's very scary for a Sagittarius ascendant most of the time. And so authenticity, you know, would be like if someone gets into a marriage and it's good at first, and, you know, then later that person, you know, their Navamsha comes out and they start trying to restrict that person and is like, no more adventures, no more pursuing spirituality. We're going to focus on business and, you know, stuff like that. Their authenticity, their devotion to their authenticity would make the Sagittarius ascendant want to leave that relationship. And so, you know, when they are in a marriage, when they are in any type of situation, they're going to want to be choosing their authenticity and their freedom above other priorities, other considerations, you know, even over the kind of letter of the law contract. And so can they meditate and find the vision, paint the picture of a life where they can have these stable connections and be 100% authentic, right? And this is one of the reasons why so many people choose polyamory with these placements, is because it can be challenging to kind of find that, to kind of see the vision. But seeing the vision is a huge part of like actually creating the geometry, of creating the attraction point to actually have that. And so, you know, the beauty of their authenticity and the challenge of kind of like the real nitty gritty rigid world is where that kind of push and pull can be. And so Virgo in the 10th house is very interesting because, again, you know, we see this capability of the Sagittarius ascendant to be very intelligent when it comes to, you know, things like career and money and things like that, with their earth signs being in, you know, 2nd, 6th, and 10th houses. And, you know, but Virgo, wherever it is, it's brilliant and it's intelligent. It has the ability to perfect things, to improve them. And it also denotes kind of like challenges and limited resources and insecurities. And so they could be a bit insecure when it comes to their career. It can feel a bit tight-fitting, a bit limiting to kind of like pursue that as a goal. The 9th house is going to feel much more authentic and, you know, expansive and things like that for them. But when it comes to their career, they have the ability to be very responsible, you know, to be very detail oriented and organized, to improve things. And that's a very powerful, beneficial thing to have. And so, you know, again, they're going to want to choose something that is authentic to them. It doesn't feel limiting. But when they are feeling that, you know, they can bring a lot of organization and responsibility to that career space. And, you know, whereas they shine and end up being kind of like the center of attention and the star of the show when it comes to their 9th house spiritual field, they might behave a bit more in the background when it comes to a kind of traditional career space. You know, they might like to support someone or support whoever that kind of 10th house figure is, you know, maybe a bit humbly, doing things behind the scenes, making sure things are running smoothly. And so they can be amazing supports in that type of area and environment. And, with Mercury ruling Virgo, their career, they're also probably going to want to have like not just one thing that they're doing all the time and they've done this same career for like 20 or 40 years. They may change their careers, have a few different ones over time. They may do kind of like multiple things at once to some extent. But they'll still have more of an intricacy and more of a detail oriented, more of a service oriented energy to their career space. And what the 10th house has a lot to do with our reputation in society, like how the world views a person. And so, if you kind of think of like a hippie again, I keep using this example, but hippies, there's so many, I've traveled with a lot of hippies, I live with a lot of hippies. So it's just like, there's so many amazing, wonderful things about them. But then when you think about a lot of like what some people would criticize about that kind of a lifestyle, it's like, well, maybe they're a bit dirty and they don't have a lot of money. They're not very organized. They kind of just live life without organization. And so that can kind of be something that could damage their reputation, whether it's true or not. Like it's something that the world can kind of see. They can be very critical of a Sagittarius ascendant for those reasons in society. And so with Virgo comes that criticism. And so, but at the same time, the intention behind the criticism ultimately is meant to kind of keep things organized and to perfect something and make it better. And so I think sometimes when society is criticizing the Sagittarius ascendant from a universal cosmic perspective, it's kind of intended, regardless of what those individuals' intentions are, the kind of cosmic intention is to help them to pay attention to the balance of life. Again, going back to this freedom and material kind of foundation contrast here, it's like, don't forget about all those things. Like, how can you unify the vision? And so that's kind of like where I think that comes into play somewhat. And with 10th house representing also like our karmas that we're here to perform in the world, like things that we're meant to do to help better the world. Sagittarius ascendants are people who can benefit the world through their service, through a kind of humble improving of things. They can find careers also in things like herbalism and acupressure and acupuncture, even massage, things like that, like health-related things can be amazingly good for a Sagittarius ascendant, to where they're helping people, they're serving people in this humble way, and it's bettering them, and and you're kind of like doing an herbalism thing. You kind of have to point out, what the problem is. It's like, oh, they're dealing with this type of a sickness or an illness. Here's what we can do to improve that, right? And so I think that's one of the areas in which they excel. And one of the areas in which they can really, really help people, whatever it is they find that personally aligns them with that kind of a sphere. And that brings us to the 11th house, which is Libra. And so, here we see that their hopes, dreams, and wishes, their incoming gains, their communal experiences are really enriched and balanced by having a deep, smooth partnership. And when it comes to their community, again, like kind of talked about this in the 4th house with their Pisces, is that peace and everybody getting along and being diplomatic and being kind is of the utmost importance. They don't really want to be in communities that are full of conflict or lower vibrations or, people being overly selfish. They want the genuine, like, good of other people to be a preeminent factor in their community. And their peace of mind And their ability to actually have happy relationships in general will increase when they have more incoming gains. And so they can kind of find that they might actually have more relationship issues if their money is struggling a lot. Those two things can be really interwoven, is that their relationships will tend to be more smooth and happy and, you know, not have as many problems when there's more money coming in. And they can get more money coming in by having these smooth, good connections with people in their relationships. And so those two things are both deeply interwoven. And so the more they can meditate on like finding that peace and connection and the authenticity there, and again, to not completely neglect the material side, but like how can, you know, the Sagittarius ascendant make money through one-on-one connections with people, through their kindness, through their working together with others, they can actually make more incoming gains. And so it can be a bit challenging if they're just, you know, being told to go out and make all this money on their own and kind of tough it up and start their own business without anybody else's help and do everything themselves. It's not really what's in their chart. It's showing it's deeply interwoven with other people, with their community, with their one-on-one relationships, with humble service and improving things. And so finding a really good community is very key, and it can actually help them find a partner too. Like the better community that they're in, like if they're with a really spiritual community, people who have a lot of peace kind of mindset, diplomatic mindset, it'll actually be a much healthier place for them to find a partner as well. And this brings us to their 12th house in Scorpio. Spicy, spicy. Very interesting. And so the 12th house, so significant. It's the spiritual world. It's dreams. It is addictions and escapism. It's the actual direct experience of spirituality. It's charity. It's so many things. And with Scorpio here, you know, one of the first things that kind of jumps out at me is that whatever's in the 12th house is something that people can kind of a bit put on the back burner or not notice as much in order to embody what's in their first house. And so Scorpio is this type of energy which can be aggressive and vengeful and intense and just like, this is mine, you know, kind of energy. And passionate and sexual in this just like fiery way. And it also represents things like traumas and kind of like negative emotions and like, you know, these deep, intense feelings that we have that's hard to let go of. And so when it comes to those things, you know, the Sagittarius ascendants will often try to let those feelings go in order to maintain their positivity. So if they're hurt by something, and, you know, something like a Scorpio ascendant might be like, I don't know how to forgive that person, you know, like never going to talk to them again, like just super intense feelings. The Sagittarius ascendant will kind of want to embody more of the forgiveness archetype. Now, again, certain placements can challenge this. They got Moon in Scorpio, you know, they got Mars in Scorpio, they got other placements going on. They might not do it as prominently, but generally speaking, they're going to be more inclined to a kind of forgiveness energy. They're going to be able to be more inclined to not going through these like cycles of like what the trauma is and what all this stuff is and just constantly thinking about it and being mad about it and, you know, trying to just endure it and gain power from their own suffering. They're going to want to gain, you know, all that from their positivity, not from their suffering. And they might avoid their suffering. You know, they could be some of the people that are very prone to spiritual bypassing. You know, if they're trauma or they're hurt, they're just like, none of that affects me. I am the most positive, you know, the most blessed, lucky, shiniest person in the world. And there's a power in that too. There really is. And at the same time, you know, it does still require actual direct healing. And so, you know, them going into those deep waters and doing shadow work is some of the most important and maybe challenging things for a Scorpio ascendant to do, or for a Sagittarius ascendant to do. You know, like if they take something like a ayahuasca or shrooms, or they're like doing a Vipassana meditation and they're like really into that 12th house energy, you know, they get drunk or something even, that Scorpio energy can come out. And so, you know, they might go into like a ayahuasca retreat, you know, like I am the most positive and I'm about to have this great experience. And then they take, you know, they get into 12th house and it's like, oh my God, all the trauma's coming out. You know, what do I do with this? And it can all just be right there. And so, you know, that's the potency of their journey and their experience with that. And what's interesting is that while it can be absolutely terrifying and overwhelming and traumatizing, there is a tremendous amount of power that resides for a Scorpio ascendant in the 12th house. You know, their spiritual houses, 9, 12, it's Leo and it's Scorpio, two of the most powerful signs in the entire zodiac. And so what's interesting is kind of like the ways in which they're powerful, whereas Leo is powerful in this shining, being 100% authentic, like being in their element, everybody loving them kind of way. And then the Scorpio side of it, which is like, you know, maybe being alone and just having to endure some of the harshest, most intense, scariest things, and drawing power from pain and suffering and all these things. And if they could do both of those things, if they could master both of those things, the amount of spiritual wisdom and balance and power can be absolutely tremendous for a Sagittarius ascendant. And, you know, they can be really, really kinky behind the scenes. Like, you know, it's amazing, you know, because 8th house is Cancer and 12th house is Scorpio, you know, with their Gemini in the 7th house, it might not look like they are as deep and as kinky and as just intense, and like they are hungry for intimacy. They are hungry for intimacy, but they might not focus on it as much during the day. They might, you know, it will come out in these kind of hidden moments. And depending on how aware the Sagittarius ascendant is of that, will kind of be a huge part in how well they can integrate that and connect to it and actually attract it. Because if they're not paying attention to it and they're doing a lot of spiritual bypassing, it can come out in some really kind of explosive, challenging ways, to where, you know, it's like when they finally are in the situation where they can get the intimacy, it might be at the lower octave level of that, to where it's like they attract a partner who, you know, super non-committal and just very, you know, polyamorous, maybe in a way that Sagittarius ascendant doesn't like if they're not into that. And then, you know, just all that intensity and addiction and intense things coming up behind the surface can be there. And so, you know, when they're kind of dealing with their trauma and their hurt and it does start coming out, it's important for them not to just escape, like turn to escapism for that, but instead to have the courage to shine their light into the darkness. Because so often people in the spiritual community think that it's one or the other. It's like if they focus on the darkness, their vibration is going to drop and they're not going to be able to feel light and they're not going to be able to feel positive anymore. But it's about integrating, being integrated, that allows you to truly shine completely. Because if those traumas and things are still there but just hidden and you're not focused on it and you're just projecting a lot of positivity and good vibes, you know, if you're looking at it with your third eye, you still see those wounds and those things there. And so all of you has yet to fully vibrate with that light. So when you want all of you to be there, facing those traumas, doing that shadow work is going to be key. And so instead of kind of like going into the dark room and leaving your light outside and then being like overwhelmed with the darkness and the trauma, instead it's like going through all these journeys and adventures in life and accumulating all of this light and this wisdom and this positivity. It's like you can shine that light into the dark places, those wounds and things that were part of the reason why the journey to set out for wisdom and light and beauty in the first place began. you can bring that light there to heal it. It's like a full circle type of thing. And so kind of embracing their darkness, not in a toxic way, not just in some violent way, but I mean like the hidden parts of themselves, the parts of themselves that they tried to push away so that they could embody this radical sense of freedom and authenticity, and then healing that so they can be fully authentic and free is where a lot of their truest, deepest states of fulfillment and satisfaction can actually come from. So I hope this video helps this, exploration of these adventurous, amazing, positive, shining, bright lights people. And really appreciate you, Sagittarius descendants. I've known quite a few that I've traveled with, and a lot of wisdom and that I've learned from them, and I've always been very grateful for them. So if you have any questions, please post them in the comments below. Honestly, all these topics we could talk about for hours and hours and hours and hours. And so I feel like even though this is an hour-long video, I feel like this is just a very surface level, analysis. And there's like a million more things I could say about it. So, I'd love to discuss things in the comments. And if you would like a reading from me, please send me an email. I'll put my email address in the description section. And look forward to our next talk. Have a lovely day.